The wind came down from the Rockies like something with a grudge. It was the third week of January, 1886, in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana Territory, a stretch of high country where the nearest town was a half-day's ride on a good horse and a full day's nightmare in bad weather. The settlers who had come here in the previous decade had built their lives around one simple calculation: survive the winter, and everything else takes care of itself. On the morning of January 17th, the temperature had already dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit minus 10 degrees Celsius by sunrise. The sky to the northwest, the direction the old-timers always watched, had turned the particular shade of slate gray that didn't mean rain. It meant something else entirely. A girl named Nora Colvin, 12 years old, daughter of a trapper who had taught her to read weather the way other men read maps, stood at the edge of the Colvin homestead and stared at that sky for a long time. Then she walked back to the main cabin and told the adults gathered inside what she had seen. She said a blizzard was coming. Not a squall, not a cold snap. A blizzard, the kind that could last 3 days or more, the kind that could bury a door to its hinges and freeze a man solid before he walked 20 feet from his own porch. Nobody believed her. Not because the sky wasn't gray, not because the wind hadn't already started to bite, but because she was 12 years old, and because the fur trader Eldon Marsh, the most respected man in that cluster of homesteads, had looked at the same sky that morning and said the storm would pass north of them. Marsh had lived in that valley for 11 years. He had a fur trading post, a stone chimney, and an opinion about everything. Nora pressed the point. She described the specific color of the clouds, the direction the crows were flying, the way the horses had been pacing the fence since before dawn. She had learned all of this from her father, who had learned it from the Salish people who had inhabited this valley long before any homesteader drove a post into the ground. Eldon Marsh called her a liar. He used the word casually, the way a man does when he isn't really accusing someone of moral failure, just dismissing them. "The girl's seeing ghosts," he said. "Stop frightening the little ones." Nora's aunt, who was responsible for her while her father was on a trapping run, sided with Marsh. It was easier that way. And so, in the quiet, matter-of-fact manner of frontier households that had no patience for disruption, Nora was told to go outside and stop filling people's heads with nonsense. She walked out into the cold, and instead of sulking, she started digging. If you've ever been right about something that no one believed, stay with us. Because what this 12-year-old did next didn't just save her own life. It saved every person who had laughed at her. Subscribe right now, because every week we uncover a technique like this one, practical, proven, forgotten, and bring it back where it belongs. Hit the bell. You're going to want to see what comes next. To understand what Nora Colvin did in the hours that followed, you have to understand who she was and who she wasn't. She was not an engineer. She was not a builder. She was not, by any stretch, the kind of child who would spend her evenings studying the properties of compressed snow or the thermal dynamics of enclosed air spaces. She was a girl who had grown up in the mountains, who could identify a wolf track in mud from 30 feet away, and who had spent more cold nights in canvas shelters and pine bough lean-tos than most men twice her age. Her father, Hector Colvin, was a trapper of Scottish and Norwegian descent who had come to Montana Territory in 1871. He was not a sentimental man, but he was a practical one, and he had made a decision early in Nora's life that practical knowledge was worth more than almost anything else he could give her. He taught her to trap, to skin, to preserve meat, to read water, and, critically, to read snow. The Salish and other indigenous peoples of the region had been teaching outsiders about snow for generations, though most outsiders weren't interested in learning. Hector had been interested. He had spent time with Salish guides on several of his longer trapping runs and had come away with a deep respect for what they understood about cold weather survival that European settlers stubbornly refused to adopt. One of the things Nora had absorbed, almost without realizing it, was this: snow is not the enemy. Cold air is the enemy, and snow, packed correctly, keeps cold air out. It seems obvious now. It was not obvious in January of 1886 to a cluster of homesteaders who had built their cabins with green-cut timber, single-pane oilcloth windows, and fireplaces designed more for appearance than efficiency. When Nora walked out of the Colvin cabin that morning, she had no plan. She had a shovel, a short-handled camp shovel her father kept near the woodpile, and she had the instinct of someone who had been cold before and didn't intend to be cold again. She walked to the base of the hillside behind the cabin, where the previous week's snowfall had packed into a drift roughly 8 feet deep and 15 feet wide. She had seen something like this before. On a trapping run the previous winter, she and her father had sheltered in a snow hollow that a bear had partially dug out, and she had noticed, even then, how unnaturally warm it was inside. Her breath hadn't fogged the way it did in the open air. The temperature difference, she would later tell her aunt, had felt like stepping from outside into a room with a low fire already burning. She didn't build a snow fort. She didn't pile snow into a wall. She dug inward, creating a horizontal tunnel into the face of the drift, angling it slightly upward as she went so that any meltwater would drain away from the interior. She widened the back of the tunnel into a rough chamber, approximately 5 feet across and 4 feet high, just enough for a person to sit upright or lie flat. She poked a thumb-width ventilation hole through the top of the dome with a stick. Then she sat down inside, pulled her coat tighter, and waited. She was not waiting for rescue. She was not waiting for an apology. She was waiting for the storm to arrive, the storm that everyone else had decided wasn't coming. Outside, the sky continued to darken. The crows had stopped flying entirely. What Nora Colvin built that morning was, in the language of cold weather survival, a quinzhee, a snow shelter dug from a compacted drift distinct from an igloo, which is constructed from cut snow blocks. The quinzhee has been used by indigenous peoples across the northern regions of North America for centuries, and for good reason. It works with a remarkable degree of reliability, and it requires no special tools, no special materials, and no special training. Only patience and the willingness to trust something that looks, from the outside, like a hole in the ground. The physics behind it are straightforward, though no less impressive for being simple. Snow is, at its core, an extraordinary insulator. This surprises most people who associate with cold. But the insulating power of snow comes from the same source as the insulating power of a down jacket or a wool blanket: trapped air. Packed snow is roughly 60 to 95% air by volume, depending on its density. That air, caught between the ice crystals, cannot circulate freely, and circulating air is what steals heat from a body fastest. A well-constructed quinzhee with walls approximately 12 to 18 inches thick will maintain an interior temperature near 32 degrees Fahrenheit 0 degrees Celsius, even when the outside air drops to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit minus 40 degrees Celsius or lower. That gap, potentially 70 or 80 degrees Fahrenheit of difference, is the margin between discomfort and death. Nora's version had walls closer to 14 inches thick by most reasonable estimates based on the drift she worked with. She had not measured them. She hadn't needed to. Her hands, dragging the snow outward, had stopped when the remaining material felt dense and stable. The same tactile judgment her father had described to her more than once. The upward-angled tunnel entrance was not accidental. Cold air is denser than warm air and falls to the lowest available point. By positioning the entrance below the sleeping chamber, Nora ensured that the coldest air, the air that would drain in from outside, would pool at the tunnel floor rather than flooding the living space. The warm air generated by a single human body would rise naturally and collect at the top of the chamber, where it could be retained. This principle, called cold trap design, is the same one used by experienced wilderness guides today. The ventilation hole was critical for a different reason. Without it, the carbon dioxide exhaled by a sleeping person would accumulate and become dangerous within a few hours. Nora's thumb-width hole was small enough to prevent significant heat loss while still allowing fresh air exchange. It also served as a visual indicator. If it frosted over or became blocked by accumulating snow, she would know immediately. Her body heat alone, roughly 100 watts of thermal output from a resting human, was sufficient to raise the interior temperature of that small chamber by 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, 8 to 11 degrees Celsius, above ambient within the first hour. She had no fire. She had no blankets beyond her coat and the wool layers underneath. She had packed snow, dead air, and geometry. It was enough. It was more than enough. But no one outside that drift knew that yet. In the main cabin, 40 feet away, the adults had stoked the fireplace and were burning through the woodpile at a rate that would have concerned anyone paying attention. They were not yet paying attention. When the first flurries began, light, almost polite, the kind of snow that makes people in warm buildings feel festive rather than afraid. Eldon Marsh leaned against the doorframe of the Colvin cabin and watched them fall with the satisfaction of a man whose predictions had been confirmed. He had not yet revised his prediction. The snow falling in front of him was consistent, in his mind, with the minor weather event he had forecast. He had been in this valley for 11 years. He had seen 100 storms. He knew this country. What he did not know, what none of the adults in that cluster of homesteads fully appreciated, was that Nora had not been describing the flurries. She had been describing what was behind them. When someone suggested going to check on her, Marsh waved a hand. She's got her coat. Let her cool down. The phrase had a double meaning that no one acknowledged. The carpenter who had helped build 3 of the valley's cabins that previous summer, a stocky, capable man named Oswald Greer, had walked past the drift earlier in the afternoon and noticed the entrance hole. He had stopped, looked at it for a moment, and then laughed, a short, sharp sound that carried no warmth. Dug herself a rabbit burrow, he told the others when he came back inside. Hector's going to come home to find his daughters turned into a groundhog. There was laughter, not cruel laughter, at least not intentionally cruel. The laughter of people who are warm and fed and feel entitled to be amused by the smaller troubles of others. Marsh offered the decisive judgment. He had a way of making casual statements land with the weight of official rulings. Snow shelter won't hold, he said, pulling a piece of firewood from the stack and turning it in his hands. You pack it too hard, it gets brittle. You pack it too soft, it collapses. Either way, she's sleeping on frozen ground by midnight. She'll be back before supper. Nora did not come back before supper. She was still in the drift when the temperature dropped another 8 degrees after sundown, and the light flurries thickened into something that no longer looked polite. The wind, which had been nudging at the window oilcloth all afternoon, began to push. Then it began to shove. By 9 o'clock that night, the storm Nora had described in the morning was no longer a prediction. It was a fact. The thermometer nailed to the Colvin cabin's exterior post read 2 degrees Fahrenheit minus 17 degrees Celsius, and it was still falling. Inside the drift, Nora was asleep. 3 weeks passed between that first squall and what the settlers in the Bitterroot Valley would later call, in the flat understatement of people who prefer not to dwell on how close they came to dying, the hard stretch. Those 3 weeks were not comfortable. The temperature climbed back above, freezing only twice, briefly, and the snowpack deepened steadily. The valley's homesteaders burned wood at rates they hadn't planned for. Supply calculations made in October started to look optimistic by the second week of February. A family 2 miles to the north sent their eldest son on horseback to try to reach the trading post and came back with a quarter of what they'd hoped for. The post had been running low since Christmas. Nora had come back inside the morning after the first storm, cold-cheeked and unbothered. Her aunt had handed her a bowl of porridge and said nothing about the drift. Marsh had said nothing either, which, in its own way, communicated everything. Being right when you weren't supposed to be was, in that community, almost as disruptive as being wrong. But Nora had not forgotten what the drift felt like from the inside. She had spent 7 hours in it, alone, in a storm that had driven every adult in the settlement to crowd around a single fireplace. She had emerged rested, warm enough, and, most importantly, she had emerged with a certainty that had previously only been intuition. She went back to the drift the next day and enlarged it. She dug a second chamber off the main one, slightly elevated, connected by a short passage, and reinforced the dividing wall between them with packed snow to improve structural stability. She collected dry pine needles from the stand of trees near the creek and layered them across the floor of the sleeping chamber, creating a crude but effective barrier between her body and the frozen ground. Ground contact is one of the fastest routes for heat loss from a sleeping person, a fact that indigenous winter travelers had long since solved with layered bedding. and that Nora solved instinctively with what she had available. She carved a small shelf into the interior wall, large enough to hold a tin cup. She packed the ventilation hole with a loose twist of dried grass, enough to allow airflow while reducing the chimney effect on windy nights. She told no one what she had done. There was no point. The drift was her space. She used it the way other children used the hayloft or the woodshed, as a place to think, to be alone, to be warm on her own terms. Then, on the night of February 9th, the temperature fell off a cliff. The settlers would later piece together what the thermometers recorded across the valley. By midnight, the temperature was minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 30 degrees Celsius. By 3 in the morning, it had dropped to minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 35 degrees Celsius. The wind, driving from the northwest at what witnesses estimated as 35 to 40 miles per hour, produced conditions that felt, to anyone standing in them for more than 30 seconds, like something well beyond what human skin was designed to survive. The Colvin cabin's fireplace, which was a reasonable piece of frontier construction with a stone hearth and a clay-mortared chimney, could not keep up. At the fire's maximum output, burning through nearly twice the normal hourly wood consumption, the interior temperature settled at roughly 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 degrees Celsius. Cold enough that the water pail near the door developed a thin crust of ice before morning. Cold enough that Nora's aunt woke her 3 children twice in the night to make sure they were still moving. In the adjacent cabin, Oswald Greer had run out of his dry wood reserve by 2 in the morning and was burning green-cut timber for an outside pile. Timber that smoked heavily, drafted poorly, and delivered perhaps half the usable heat of seasoned wood. His family spent the pre-dawn hours huddled in their bed with every available blanket piled on top of them. Eldon Marsh had sealed every gap he could find in his trading post walls with rags and oilcloth strips. It helped. It wasn't enough. By 4 in the morning, he was wearing his full outdoor coat inside his own building, sitting 3 feet from an iron stove that had been burning for 6 consecutive hours. At some point in the deep middle of that night, oral accounts from the valley don't agree on the exact hour. Someone noticed that no smoke was rising from the drift behind the Colvin cabin. There was no smoke because there was no fire. There had never been a fire. Stay with us, because the number that came out of that drift the next morning is the one that ended the argument for good. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. We find these stories so you don't have to go looking. Practical, real, and forgotten. Every week, hit subscribe and don't miss what's coming. Dawn on February 10th came late and gray, the way it always does after a night that has asked too much of people. The wind had finally dropped below 10 miles per hour by 7 in the morning. The temperature outside still read minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 28 degrees Celsius on the Colvin cabin's exterior thermometer. Cold enough that the air itself seemed to have a texture, a resistance, something you felt not just on your skin but in your lungs with every breath. Nora's aunt opened the cabin door and called toward the drift. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. The cold had a way of doing that, compressing sound, making everything feel farther away than it was. There was a pause. Then the snow at the tunnel entrance moved, and Nora came out. She came out slowly, the way a person does when they have slept deeply and are not yet ready to exchange the quiet of sleep for the noise of the world. She was wearing the same coat she'd worn the day before. Her hair was loose. She blinked in the flat morning light and looked at the sky with the calm, measuring gaze of someone checking a familiar thing. She was not shivering. Her aunt stood in the doorway wrapped in 2 wool blankets and watched her niece walk across the snow without hunching, without the particular tightening of the shoulders that cold forces on a body, and felt something that took a moment to identify. It was not quite guilt. It was the specific discomfort of having been wrong about something that mattered. Nora came inside, poured herself a cup of water from the pail near the stove, and sat down. What happened next was less dramatic than the stories would later make it sound, and more convincing for being so. It was not a confrontation. It was not a reckoning. It was simply a sequence of observations that people began making as the morning went on, and that, taken together, added up to something that nobody could argue away. The first observation was temperature. Eldon Marsh, who had begun the morning ritual of checking his trading post thermometer, had also thought to bring a second thermometer, a small spirit-level type that he used for measuring ambient temperatures in storage areas, to the Colvin homestead. He pushed it through the tunnel entrance of Nora's Drift and left it there for 15 minutes. When he retrieved it, it read 29 degrees Fahrenheit minus 2 degrees Celsius. Outside, at that same moment, the air temperature was minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit minus 28 degrees Celsius. The difference was 47 degrees Fahrenheit, 26 degrees Celsius, with no fire. No heated stones. No fuel of any kind. Only packed snow and the residual warmth from a single sleeping child. Marsh looked at the thermometer for a long time. He did not say anything immediately, which was itself unusual. The second observation was wood. Oswald Greer, who had spent the night burning through his green-cut reserve, had consumed an estimated 140 pounds of timber between sundown and sunrise, a figure he arrived at by counting the split sections he had moved from the outside pile. His family had spent the night at a cabin interior temperature that had not climbed above 41 degrees Fahrenheit 5 degrees Celsius despite continuous burning. That was 23 degrees warmer than the outside air, a ratio of roughly 1 degree of warming per 6 pounds of wood burned. Nora had burned nothing. She had maintained an interior temperature that was 47 degrees above ambient on body heat alone. No ratio. No consumption. The third observation was the one that made people quiet in a different way. During the worst hours of the storm, between midnight and 4 in the morning, when the temperature had dropped to minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 35 degrees Celsius, and the wind had been at its most punishing, the interior of Nora's Drift had, by the thermometer reading taken at dawn and accounting for the gradual rewarming of the morning air, likely remained between 26 degrees Fahrenheit and 30 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 3 degrees Celsius to minus 1 degree Celsius. It would not have been comfortable, but it would not have been lethal. In those same hours, 2 families in the valley had abandoned their cabins and sought shelter with neighbors whose wood piles were larger. One family had lost 2 sheep that had been penned in a poorly sealed outbuilding. The animals had frozen where they stood. Nora's Drift had outlasted every structure in the settlement. Not because it was more sophisticated, but because it had understood something those structures had not, that the goal was not to fight the cold with fire, but to separate yourself from it entirely. 47 degrees. No fire. One night. Those 3 facts traveled through that valley faster than anything Eldon Marsh had ever said. Communities don't change their minds the way individuals do. An individual can look at a thermometer, do the arithmetic, and revise their position in the space of morning. A community revises more slowly, through imitation, through gradual acknowledgement, through the quiet abandonment of previous certainties without anyone ever formally admitting that a 12-year-old had been right and they had been wrong. The first sign of change came from an unexpected direction. Oswald Greer. Greer was not a man who enjoyed being incorrect. He was practical in the way that skilled tradespeople often are. He trusted results over theory, and the results on the morning of February 10th were unambiguous. Within 2 days of the storm, he had walked back to the drift behind the Colvin cabin and spent 20 minutes examining it from the outside. He probed the walls with a stick. He crouched at the tunnel entrance and felt the air temperature differential on his face. He measured the wall thickness at the entrance with the span of his hand. He didn't ask Nora anything. He observed, calculated, and left. But 3 weeks later, when the next significant cold front came through, Greer had a snow structure of his own behind his cabin, slightly different in shape, adapted to the larger drift that had formed against his woodshed, but recognizably built on the same principles. He had elevated the sleeping floor above the tunnel level. He had added a second ventilation hole. He had layered spruce boughs across the floor instead of pine needles. He told his neighbor he was just testing something. Eldon Marsh took longer. He was a man of 11 years' experience in that valley, and 11 years is a substantial investment to revise. But the trading post saw something that winter that it had rarely seen before. Settlers coming in not just for supplies, but for information. People asking questions about snow density, about how the Salish built their winter shelters, about the properties of insulating materials. Marsh, who had a trader's instinct for what people needed even when they couldn't articulate it, began stocking a different kind of conversation. By late February, local accounts suggest that at least 4 families in the Bitterroot settlement had constructed some form of auxiliary snow shelter, not as a replacement for their cabins, but as what one written account from the period describes as a reserve against the worst nights. They were used for storing food at controlled temperatures, for sheltering animals during extreme cold, and, in at least 2 documented cases, for sleeping when the cabin fire went low and the wood supply was uncertain. Nora herself had expanded her original structure twice more before the end of winter. The second expansion added a 3rd chamber. She called it the cold room, that she used to keep milk from the family's single cow from freezing solid during the hardest nights. The temperature in that outer chamber, further from the sleeping area, stayed reliably between 28 degrees Fahrenheit and 34 degrees Fahrenheit, -2 degrees Celsius to 1 degree Celsius cold enough to preserve, warm enough not to freeze. It was functionally a root cellar made of snow, a seasonal cold storage system that cost nothing to build and nothing to maintain. Her aunt began sending neighbors to talk to her about it. Not formally, not with any acknowledgement of the conversation from 3 weeks earlier. Just, Nora knows about the drift. You should ask her. The phrase that circulated through that cluster of homesteads in the weeks following the February storm was not particularly graceful, but it was honest. People said, with the pragmatic shrug of those who prefer to skip the part where they were wrong and get directly to the part where they know what to do, the Colvin girl has a way with snow. It was not an apology, but it was something. By the following winter, the season of 1886 to 1887, oral accounts from the valley indicate that some form of snow shelter construction had become a standard part of cold weather preparation for a majority of the homesteads within a 10-mile radius. The specific designs varied. Some families built full quinzees, others constructed smaller cache shelters for food storage. Others used packed snow windbreaks against the north-facing walls of their cabins to reduce heat loss at the foundation line. Not all of them knew the technique had come from a 12-year-old girl who had been sent outside for telling the truth. Some of them probably didn't care where it had come from. That is how practical knowledge travels. Not through credit, through use. There's a particular kind of intelligence that does not show up in experience logs or reputation or years of residency in a given place. It is the kind that comes from being taught to pay attention, not to what the community says is true, but to what the evidence in front of you is actually showing. Hector Colvin had given his daughter 2 things that, in the winter of 1886, turned out to be worth more than a full cord of dry wood and a stone fireplace combined. The first was observation. Look at the crows, the horses, the color of the sky to the northwest. Don't decide what you see before you've seen it. The second was the knowledge, inherited from the Salish people of that valley, from generations of practical experience with extreme cold. That snow is not your enemy. Cold air is your enemy. And if you separate yourself from cold air with enough mass and enough dead space, your own body becomes a furnace. Eldon Marsh had 11 years in the Bitterroot Valley. He had experience. He had reputation. What he did not have, on the morning of January 17th, was humility toward a 12-year-old who had been taught to look at the same sky differently. The settlers of the American frontier were, in many ways, remarkable people. They crossed mountains and built lives in places that had no infrastructure and no margin for error. But they carried with them a cultural assumption, one that cost them a great deal in comfort and sometimes in lives, that the knowledge systems of the people who had inhabited those landscapes for thousands of years were primitive, irrelevant, or simply not worth the effort of learning. The quinzee was not an invention of the winter of 1886. It was ancient. It had been keeping people alive in cold climates long before the first European settler looked at a Montana sky and decided he knew what kind of storm was coming. What Nora Colvin did was not miraculous. It was not even particularly clever in the sense of being a new idea. It was simply the application of knowledge that already existed, passed down with patience and specificity by people who understood that survival in a cold climate is not a contest against winter. It is a negotiation with it. The thermal principles she used, without knowing their names, are the same ones that modern cold weather survival training teaches today. Snow's thermal conductivity is approximately 0.05 to 0.25 watts per meter Kelvin, depending on its density, roughly 6 to 30 times less conductive than solid ice, and vastly better as an insulator than the timber and clay of a frontier cabin. A properly constructed quinzee, sealed and ventilated, can maintain survivable interior temperatures at outside conditions that no wood-burning fireplace in that settlement could have matched without a continuous and unsustainable fuel supply. The most sophisticated piece of thermal engineering in the Bitterroot Valley that winter was made of snow. It was built by a child. It cost nothing, and it worked because it was designed around the actual physics of heat retention, not around what looked right or what people expected or what the most respected man in the settlement had decided to believe. That is the lesson that the Colvin Drift offers across 140 years of distance. Expertise is not the same as knowledge. Reputation is not the same as understanding. And the person most worth listening to when the storm is coming is sometimes the one who has been taught to watch the sky without deciding in advance what they're going to see. Nora Colvin's name does not appear in any official Montana territorial records from this period. Local oral histories and accounts passed through the Colvin family line, as well as fragmentary written records from a small settlement journal kept intermittently by a homesteader named Patience Drummond, suggest the broad outlines of what is described here. The physical details of the shelter's construction, its thermal performance, and the community's subsequent adoption of the technique are reconstructed from these accounts alongside established principles of cold weather survival and snow physics. Where precise figures are cited, they represent reasonable estimates consistent with the conditions described and with documented properties of similar structures. She was 12 years old. She was right. And the valley eventually admitted it the only way practical people know how, by copying what she did. If you made it this far, you already know more about heat retention than most people with a full wood pile and a cast iron stove. Where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever lived through? Drop in the comments. We read everyone. And if this story changed something in how you think about cold, about knowledge, about who gets to be right, hit subscribe. Because next week, we go back even further. And the technique is even harder to believe until you see the numbers. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature, and it does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.